This is ACA's premier event, and one that it's a big deal to me. I always enjoy this. We've been finding out in the last couple of years that people were actually coming from out of town, some distance sometime, to see this. So we wanted to make it a little bit longer day, add an extra event. So Matt has great.
This is the best we could come on.
Now, Matt has given this talk around the country, and I was trying to rope him into an ACA lecture, but this opportunity came up, so I think this is much better. Sorry about the temperature. I know it's a little warmer than y'all are used to. Also, let me explain a little bit about the set. The people that were in here before it's a theater group, and they're doing a production that takes place in a monastery. So that's why you have the set with the religious symbols and stuff like that. They're not making fun of us.
It is a church.
Oh, yeah, it is a church, but they don't really go into it for a whole lot of the religious symbols. So.
Yeah, there were some people who asked, and for those who aren't aware, Unitarian Universalist churches are where a lot of atheists and agnostics and freethinkers spend their Sundays. Don't ask me why. Actually, I don't. It's because we're social animals who appreciate that and enjoy it. If we didn't have something similar, yeah.
I was just curious if other people besides me are warm, why don't we turn on the ceiling fans?
Yeah, I tried to pull them. It didn't come on. I don't know if there's a switch somewhere, but if Don, if you want to investigate fan switches, well.
Sure will.
So is everybody here for the back cruise too? Mm-hmm. Awesome. You don't have to. We're done.
All right. Nobody knows me.
I'm preaching to the choir today for sure, everyone. It's 3:15. This will not go on terribly long because I've done it several times, and I don't think that I'll get the same questions from some of you that I've gotten from other places that I've been. And we need to be downtown by 5:30, and I realized this week that we scheduled the back cruise at the beginning of the Con Street Festival and on a UT game day. So we're going to need to get on. Thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it, and hopefully we've added a little something to this. I gave this first at Washington State University, and then at Bradley, and at an atheist group in Nashville, North Carolina. What's that? Oh. All right. She didn't even. Every group recorded it, and every group was going to post it, and nobody did. So, of course, I mentioned it on the show thinking it was going to be posted, and everybody's like, where is it? Where is it? So we're doing it again. We're recording it. Some of this is going to seem very obvious. Some of it may seem a little overly pedantic. And I suspect that, like I said, I'm preaching mostly to the choir today. But after giving this talk a few times, I found there's a few things that needed to be included because of questions I was asked after the lecture was over. And so please don't think that I'm overstating the obvious for you. It's in part because we're recording it. I kid you not, after this was over, and this will be funnier to you at the end, but after I finished this lecture, the very first question I got was from a young woman in the back who said, I understand what you said, but where do atheists get their morals from? And I was like, what on earth? I just was dumbfounded. It proved to be a very important point that I'll touch on at the end if we have time. So 10 years ago, I was a fundamentalist Christian. I was convinced that the Christian Bible was the inspired word of the living God, and that the moral values and views that it contained were correct, immutable, and beyond question. My understanding of the views of the secular community was limited, to put it mildly. I can remember only 2 occasions growing up when these subjects ever even arose. The first happened when I was pretty young. I was flipping through the channels one afternoon, and I came across an episode of Dillahunty show, and there was a woman on there who said something negative about Christianity, and I was a kid, I had no idea, and I just started watching it because it piqued my curiosity. And my mom came in and told me to turn it off, that the woman in question was an evil atheist who was bent on destroying God's country and stealing away our right to pray. I'm not exactly sure what she said, but the impression that was left with me was that this was an evil, God-hating, anti-everything person who was bent on destruction. 5 years later, I finally understood that the woman in question was, of course, Madeleine Mary O'Hare. me being here in Austin, where American Atheist was originally set up. The second memory is a little less clear. I remember hearing the phrase secular humanist, probably on an episode of the 700 Club. During the day, my mom would have the 700 Club on television, and I would be doing something else in the living room, not paying a great deal of attention to it. So I was, I guess, subconsciously being fed religious ideas that I wasn't aware of. But I heard the phrase, and I heard what they were talking about, and they seemed to be kind of passionate about this secular humanist thing. And so I asked my mom what it was, and she pretty much replied that it was code for evil atheists, like we talked about before. That was it. For many years, that's all I knew about the secular perspective, and I was pretty sure that's all I needed to know. These weren't just lost souls in need of salvation. They were vile apostates who directly opposed God's moral law, and God had given them over to reprobate minds and all the other verses that we know about. They weren't beyond salvation, because nobody was, but they were working for Satan, even though they didn't realize it. I don't want to waste a whole bunch of time talking about my journey from fundamentalist Christian, intent on heeding the call to the ministry, to outspoken atheist apostate who destroys everything that people believe in, because I've talked about it before, and most of you are probably familiar with it. But it's important for those who don't know me, who might be watching this, to understand that I was once of a very different mindset than I am today. So I'm going to talk a little about the superiority of secular morality. I didn't have to look at that to remind myself what I was talking about. One of the most commonly addressed subjects, I get it all the time in email, it comes up all the time in the show, I see it in message boards, and not just directed at me, like answer this question, but we get email from people who watch the show who say, oh, I got into this debate and now I'm stuck and I don't know what to do. Can you please help me out? And that's why I don't have any hair anymore. But we're going to go ahead and tackle this issue as best we can today. A grand lie has been spread. It's a lie that I used to believe. It's a lie that I hear and read on a nearly weekly basis. It's a lie that muddles the subject of morality and preys on our intellectual laziness and fears. That lie begins by trying to claim that you can't have morals without some external authority. And then, if you manage to push the subject, they'll capitulate that you can, in fact, have some moral sense without that external authority, but that they're inferior. That admission, I think, destroys their first claim outright and hardly needs to be addressed any further. But this claim that secular morality is inferior, both in its principles and in its methods, is what we're going to address mostly today. Secular morals are superior in almost every demonstrable way. And hopefully, this is something that everybody would eventually agree with, based on what we're going to talk about today. So why are secular moral systems superior? Because I said so. You guys enjoy your back cruise? Have fun. That answer, because I said so, is not very satisfying. I think we all figured that out when we were really little. And there's a reason why it's not very satisfying, and it's because when we ask a question, we're looking for an actual answer, we're looking for an explanation, we're looking for something that increases our understanding of the subject. And because I said so, it doesn't do that at all. It's a roadblock. The fact that a response isn't satisfying doesn't mean it's not true, though. But the reason we're disappointed is that this isn't an explanation. And we want explanations. We crave explanations. So saying that secular morality is superior because I said so, not going to be satisfying. But we'll actually get back to that a little later. When we're assessing an action, and I do believe that this applies only to actions, the thought police can come pull me on the side afterwards. But the determination of whether something is moral or immoral is based on evaluating an action with respect to some standard or value. Positive evaluations end up labeled morally good, morally right, and negative evaluations are labeled as evil or wrong. Morally neutral assessments may be truly neutral, or simply so complex or subjective that a clear evaluation may not be possible. It makes no difference, though, whether the standard by which you're measured is ultimately the source of a subjective opinion or an objective truth. Once you have the standard, the assessment with respect to that standard becomes objective. There's a lot of bickering about objective morality versus is subjective morality, moral relativism, and moral absolutes. And I probably won't get into too much of that today. The point is that if you can agree on a standard, you can make an objective assessment. The standard itself may be subjective ultimately. We can assess any action with respect to any standard or value. And consider chess for a moment. It's a game with rules, and those rules might have been the result of careful thought, they could have been the result of play testing, years of evolving gameplay, or they could have been just arbitrarily thought up. Here's the rules, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to play it. But, irrespective of how those rules came about, we can assess each player's moves with respect to those rules. The rules of chess aren't directly analogous to morals. They're rigid, they're externally imposed, but the creation of the game is somewhat analogous. And the strategy that one uses to play the game is what we're really talking about when we talk about moral systems. Would it be fair to say that the strategy one uses in chess is subjective? Sure. But as long as the goal is to win the game, or to avoid losing at a minimum, we're able to evaluate the strategy, which is subjective and individualized, with respect to that goal of winning the game. It would be dishonest to imply that because different people have different strategies that we are, as a collective, somehow unable to say anything about which strategy is superior. We judge a strategy by its results, comparing its results to the goal. We can identify actions that are better or worse, even if we're unable to identify absolutes or clearly define the best move. In a game of chess, there are a number of options, and some are clearly better than others, just as we can identify that, generally speaking, if our goal is to make friends with somebody, it's probably, you're more likely to succeed by offering them a gift than you are by stealing their car. Those are extremes, and we can easily identify the extremes. Everybody can do it. It's trivial. It's one of the reasons why the subject of morality is so muddied, because there are things that are patently obvious to everybody, yet nobody understands why. Or almost nobody understands why. Or maybe we're not even sure who understands why. We can argue about it. But we can identify those extremes, and people who are uncomfortable with the things in between the extremes, the spectrum of possible actions that we take. Some people want to appeal to external authorities, and those external authorities tend to oversimplify the options. There's a broad range of possibilities between offering a gift and stealing somebody's car, and the test of the strategy is in determining how accurately and efficiently it assists you in placing actions within that spectrum. How does your system of morality, how effective is it at figuring out how good something is or how bad something is? It's, what process goes through the comparison to determine those goals, or how results meet those goals. One advantage of secular morality is that we can assess any strategy on its own merits, and we can use those obvious extremes as a guideline to help filter the scenarios that are less obvious. It's much the same way we do in science and disciplines where we have this amassed human knowledge. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. We can benefit from the wisdom of the people who came before us. Similarly, we can compare extremes. We do it all the time. Well, this isn't bad, but could it be bad or could it be worse? We have slippery slope arguments where, well, if you legalize marijuana, next you'll have to legalize crack. No, you don't. That's absurd. But why do they go to that every time? It's because it's obvious to everybody, or almost everybody, that legalizing crack is probably a really bad thing. And they're using it to misrepresent, in this oversimplification that I was talking about, the legalization of marijuana, which, by the way, I'm in favor of, and I don't smoke. Was there something there I missed? Oh, it did. So I'd like to address some of the aspects of moral strategy by contrasting secular moral systems with, see, that's so slow I have to focus on this. By contrasting secular moral systems with non-secular moral systems, by considering what is the origin of the core values and goals in each system, whose interests are served, how does each system handle the issues of justification and authority, what does each system address, the need for modifications to the values and the goals, what process does each use for resolving conflicts about values, and how robust or flexible is each system. You guys are going to quickly sense a trend, probably by the next slide. Imagine you were going to design a game system or government. You can get out of the games if you want, or tend to use games because we have things that, even lifelike games, where we try to mimic life and have second lives and things like that. But if you're going to design it, do you design it with the best interests of the participants in mind? Is your goal to make a system that is profitable for you, and note that profitability may be a direct result of making a system that is beneficial to the players? Is your goal to make a system that you participate in, or is it a system for other people to participate in? Are you a member of the player set, or are you an external authority deciding what the players can do? How do you determine the core values that will serve as a foundation for this system? What consideration are you going to give to the interest of each individual that's going to be a participant? In secular systems, the source of the core values is internal to the system. It's predicated on the views, both rational and emotional. We're not saying anything about discouraging anybody's feelings. One of the third question I got was, what about love? You know, this all sounds rational, but what about love? You're just discounting emotion. No, we're not. We're just saying that the source of the core values are internal to the system, which means I can have as a value, if I want to justify it, the fact that I'm going to treat her better than somebody else because I have an emotional attachment to her. That's Beth, by the way. In non-secular systems, the source is external to the system. There's no direct link, no necessary direct link between the values and the players. By external, we might mean external in a transcendent sense, as many religions adopt, this idea of some governing God figure that is outside the system, imposing its moral views on the players within. Also outside the system, we might talk about in an above-the-law sense, as you might have in a dictatorship, where you have this individual who's imposing the rules on everybody else, but it's a real person, and he just is above the law and doesn't have to play by those rules. And also in the no longer applicable sense, it is outside the system. Some ancient person, a human being who actually existed, came up with a bunch of rules, and some people adopted them because they seemed good at the time, and now they stick with them, even though the individual who came up with them is no longer able to participate in the creation and modification of those values. It's true that we might wind up being happy if somebody else picks your career or your mate or your, I don't even know if somebody can pick your values for you, but the idea that somebody else can impose those things isn't always bad. We see this, in the parent-child dynamic, where the parent has information and they're going to make some decisions on behalf of their child, and those decisions are in their best interest generally. But that's not the same as deciding what somebody else's values are. The point is that external systems aren't necessarily evil or bad or not even in your best interest. It's just that there's no guarantee that you are able to participate in the creation of those core values and the decisions that get made in that process. One path, the secular path, allows us the freedom to change and seek happiness on some other path if we find out things aren't working out. Whose interests are served? Like I said, you're going to see a trend right off the bat. Secular systems serve the interests of those inside the system. That's where we got the core values from. These are the individuals that we are interested in. We are not trying to benefit the external source or know any external source at all. It is all internal. Non-secular systems may or may not serve the interests of the players within. There's no guarantee. There may be a claim that they're working in the best interest of the players, but they ultimately conform to some external opinion of what is in the best interest of the players. Was it any consolation at all to hear a parent say, "I'm doing this for your own good"? They may have been, and they may have been right. They weren't always right. There's no guarantee they're always going to be right. And they're not always going to be actually acting in your best interest. What they're actually doing is acting in what they perceive your best interest to be. And in the parent-child dynamic, that's generally okay, because we have this responsibility of passing on the information we gained and protecting our young and helping them to build up the tool set they need to make these decisions on their own in the future. Secular systems rely on an internal authority for those values, goals, and enforcement. They're self-organized, modified, and enforced. Non-secular systems rely on external authorities for each of these. one key point to note is the internal authorities are accepted while the external authorities are imposed. The issue isn't one of whether or not the ultimate source of an external imposed system exists or not. I couldn't care less whether or not the external source actually exists. What we're assessing here is both the values that come from that source and the system that is those values predicate. As I've noted before, I don't believe that the biblical God exists. I know that's going to come as a surprise to everyone here. But if it does, that doesn't mean that its views are right. It doesn't mean that I have to consider its views to be correct. It doesn't mean that I have to recognize its authority. It may be the case, as we've seen many times in many countries where people are oppressed, that the correct moral action would be to resist any such might makes right authority, which is exactly what you get with the non-secular top-down, there's a God dictating what your values should be. And the easiest single question I ever came up with to address this happened after a lecture. When people try to assert that, well, okay, I can shrug off this God thing, but I'm telling you he's real, and someday you're going to have to pay. And I just asked, if you got a bill for a service that you never signed up for, would you pay it? I wouldn't. There has to be some demonstration of authority. There has to be some demonstration of, you owe us why. There has to be a, I am your authority because. And if the answer is only one of might makes right, there is nothing at all moral about that. It is morally ambivalent. It has no bearing on whether or not the positions being imposed have any moral value. Might makes right doesn't do anything. I mean, you run around beating people with a stick and say, I'm right. Nobody's going to be convinced you're right. They may pretend to agree with you long enough to avoid being hit, but that's just about it. Secular moral systems are not simply fiat declarations. Their authority comes from the participants by agreement and are justified by the fact that it works. When it comes to the modification and alteration of the systems, like I said, there's a big trend here. Secular systems are internal, dynamic, and encourage change. The system not only permits change and encourages change, and secular moral systems have as a primary goal the best interests of the participants. If that's your primary goal, and you discover that the secondary goals you put in place are conflicting with that goal, then you've identified a problem. And as the participants or the architects of the system, they're free, if not actually obligated, to make changes. This hierarchical system builds upon not only the primary goals, but on the information we gain from the application of this system. And I'll touch on this more in a minute when we start talking about what kind of core values one might engage in and compare, but there's going to be a conflict at some point. There's no perfect, there's no one-size-fits-all answer for every possible scenario and situation. And so how your moral system deals with those complex situations and how your moral system works to enact change is critical. And in a secular system, change is encouraged. It's the reason we have, I would say, any progress at all on this front. The change is based on new information. Hey, look, this group doesn't like being second-class citizens, and this is causing conflict in the system. Maybe our predetermined value over here that males are better than females or whites are better than blacks, this thing that we held up on high as a value, maybe it's wrong, and so we change it. But if it's written in stone, you can't. Chess is a great game, which is one of the reasons why I keep referencing it over and over again. But what if we found out that there was a way to improve it? What if we had house rules, or just altered them altogether? We have house rules for lots of other games, I'm sure, when, especially parents with kids. You're not going to necessarily throw a kid into a board game that's way over their head without assistance. Or I'll show you my hand, and let me help you play this. That's more instructive, but we change the rules of games all the time. Flag football is an extension of tackle football, and every new game is probably a modification of some old game or fundamental principle for the game. As long as we're in agreement on what the new rules are, everything's fair. We can change the rules as we discover problems, and if we were to solve chess and determine that the game is imbalanced, that in other words, with perfect play, one side can always force a win, it may be in our best interest to change the rules. As it stands now, I don't see too many chess groups changing the rules of chess. It's withstood the test of time, but as computing power increases, we might find out that there's a serious problem in the game, at which point it'll lose some of its appeal in much the way that tic-tac-toe has lost appeal. Balance isn't always the goal. Tic-tac-toe is about as balanced as you can get. That's the reason why nobody plays it. Or at least, after the third grade or so. Secular moral systems don't just allow us to change the game. They allow us to change with the game. Because we live in a dynamic world that is constantly changing, and we are constantly facing new situations. The big benefit is that we have our past experience and these other situations where we've already solved the problems, or at least come up with a resolution that's satisfying. We can use those to apply to new situations. Non-secular systems don't normally permit change, or if they do, those changes come from an external source. You get a New Testament type thing, or a new prophet, or some seeing stones that tell you more about when Jesus was hiding away with the Indians in the United States. They're generally rigid, non-secular systems, and if there are any changes, they still may not consider the best interests of the participants. When you see a non-secular, when you see a religious moral system change, it's often because it's been forced to from outside, and it still may not be the right change. As a matter of fact, usually they'll half-step. In some cases, those half-steps make things worse. Don't ask for examples, because they're horrific. But the static or sluggish nature of non-secular moral systems ensures that they are constantly in danger of having the world pass them by. That is the only thing that drives change in a religious system. The fear of obsolescence, which I would say is probably my goal. So, and when I talk about conflict resolution here, I don't know that it was necessarily clear from the slide alone. I'm not talking about how do we end war or anything. I'm talking about within an individual moral system, there are conflicts that are going to arise. How do you deal with them? And again, we're back at the same trend. What happens when one system finds itself in conflict with another moral system, or with itself, or when one or more of these systems needs to change? What method is used to resolve the conflicts? Secular systems tend to be data and results driven. They tend to rely on debate, discussion, and the evaluation of evidence. These are the ideals. Obviously, we don't always live up to these ideals. We're all imperfect, and we can't always rely on others to be convinced by reason and evidence. And so I don't think for a minute that I'm advocating an entirely pacifist position where, oh, well, we can't work it out with these religious folks, so we'll just let them run right over it, because that's just not what I do. Generally speaking, though, secular systems are inclusive and participatory. And the more people who willingly adopt secular systems, the easier it becomes to resolve conflicts, because now you're dealing with more and more people internal. Critical thinking skills, skepticism, and reasoning may be the greatest things we can ever teach another person. Non-secular systems rely on coercion or conversion. Conversion attempts to, or often purports to rely on evidence, but they aren't tied to the evidence, and they'll resort to emotional appeals or force when the evidence doesn't support the system. Generally speaking, they're divisive. It is, you are necessarily a part of our little system, or you're not, in which case you are absolutely wrong and have nothing to benefit us, because we're not interested in change. Now, one of the key differences, because somebody says, well, secular moral systems are just like that. You've got your secular moral system, and you're saying, you're not part of us, and you're wrong, and nothing you have is a benefit. That's not what I say at all. I say, you're welcome to join us. You may have some things to add that may be beneficial. But right now, you're really freaking wrong, and we can talk about how to change it. But you're the one that's unwilling to change. You, in the non-secular, the religious moral system, are the one that are holding up this rigid line that's being divisive. And we're saying, hey, you can come over here. And by the way, the come over here thing is when you're going to the religion, you actually have to go over there. When religions come to the secular, it's kind of, it widens the gap between both of them. We all benefit. We can all learn things. It would be absurd to think that after thousands of years of human beings thinking about the situations that we have, that we would find nothing beneficial in religion. That's asinine. Of course we do. Nobody would propose that religion managed, or any religion managed to get everything wrong, except maybe Scientology. If you consider a world where there were no secular moral systems, a world where we simply had competing religious claims, all citing their own supreme authority or their own particular deity, their own sacred text or great thinker, how do we settle disputes? There is no reasoning in that system. It is all conquest. It is all conversion. It is all coercion. This is my house, young man, and as long as you're under it, you will do what I say, and you will worship our God, and you will do this. It is all indoctrination. There is no enlightenment in this fantasy picture. Fortunately, we don't live in that world. And oddly enough, neither do most of the religious people. For some reason, I'm not advancing to the next slide. So, the last criteria that I was going to compare, and it'll continue the trend. Why is that not advancing? Whoop. So, secular systems are more complex. And they're more complex because they've been allowed to evolve and mature. Because they've been modified to adapt to situations in the past, there are, relatively speaking, fewer, quote-unquote, new situations for them to deal with. Now, I don't want anybody to think that I've gone off the deep end. Of course, there are always new situations. But the thing is, the more situations you've dealt with, the larger your pool is with which to compare all the other situations. So there are fewer and fewer big, unresolved surprises. We're building up wealth of knowledge, standing on the shoulders of giants, as I mentioned before. Additionally, we're able to spend more energy focusing on the new situations that don't clearly fit into previously assessed sets of values, rather than continually treading water, trying to solve the same problems over and over again. How many times do we need to have this creation versus evolution fight take place in school? That really is not a moral thing, but it's the first example that leaps to mind about how religions tend to tread water. And they keep battling the same issue over and over and over again because they're butting heads with a secular progressive moral system or a secular progressive science system or anything else that conflicts with their rigid structure. They're less flexible, they're immutable to resistance, they're immutable and resistant to change. And non-secular systems tend to remain simplistic, and to the extent that they do change, they tend to trail behind their secular counterparts. Look at the United States Criminal Code regarding the killing of another person. This is a robust example of an evolving, thoughtful process of revision. Instead of something simplistic, as we would see in a rigid system like thou shalt not kill, we have something complex in a very flexible system. If I run over you with my car, is it murder? What degree of murder? Is it felony murder? Is it manslaughter? Was it accidental? Is it negligent homicide? Maybe it's suicide. We live in a world that recognizes that thou shalt not kill didn't tell us much. Actually, it didn't tell us anything. Anybody who wasn't already aware that killing is generally a bad thing, by the time those commandments got hammered out, they were probably a lost cause. I mean, maybe I'm being a little anachronistic, but generally I think that it could have been a little more detailed than that, especially if you're getting your information from an all-knowing ruler of the universe. So we recognize that motive and intent are relevant in assessing moral character of an act. Imagine that you have two children, and I've used this example before, so some of you heard it, and they misbehave when you take them out in public. And over the course of a year, you get to a point where both of them will behave in public. Their actions are now similar. They're both good kids in your house. If one of them behaves because they have a proper understanding of sharing space in a cooperative society and an actual desire to make that society as positive for all the participants as possible, and the other behaves simply because he's been threatened with punishment or promised a reward, which is the better child? I would hope that almost everybody would say that the motive and intent is valuable. And the kid who is being good because he understands the benefits of being good, the value of being good, even for its own sake, is the one that actually has a better moral character. I mean, we can teach a dog not to do things by giving it treats and rewards. As a matter of fact, there are sometimes that just saying, giving your dog a hug is enough of a reward. And then they can appreciate that doing the right thing is its own reward. So, not only does the motivation matter in that particular situation, but that motivation is the foundation of 1,000 other moral decisions. What happens to that other child when the carrot and stick are removed, when mommy and daddy are no longer around? What sort of contributions will they make to a cooperative society if they never truly learn the nature of actions, consequences, boundaries, and freedoms? We recognize that being good for goodness sake is superior. The absence of a complete and clearly defined standard is not the equivalent of having no values and no way to construct a standard. That's a lot to say. It's one of the things that I wanted to harp on the most. And so I'll touch on this for a couple minutes. The most common objections I hear to secular morality are based on the flawed argument that an absence of a clearly defined best strategy is the equivalent of having no strategy at all, or that the dissent of any individual with respect to the best strategy necessarily undermines the significance or consensus of others. This simply isn't true. You may be able to find someone who sincerely thinks that it would be moral to exterminate every lawyer, but that doesn't change the fact that we can clearly identify that it's wrong and why it's wrong. All opinions are not of similar significance. This is the part of the talk that tends to either win support or get people's heads shaken. Because I'm automatically saying there are people that you don't have to listen to when it comes to these issues, which is going to seem a little confusing, but I'll do what I can to get through this. Those who, for example, want to kill all the lawyers are entitled to their opinion. They're entitled to share their opinion. But we're not in any way obligated to give their opinions any weight when we're constructing our moral system. In part because it's our moral system. And also because we already know that this action leads to results which are contrary to the goals of a healthy and productive society. We already know that it's a bad move, or at least my lawyer says it's a bad move. Consider, for example, the legal movement of a knight on a chessboard. We're back to chess again. Hopefully somebody here plays chess. This is just all from me. If you ask one player to describe the movement of a knight on a chessboard, he might say the knight moves orthogonally one square and diagonally one square. Another player might describe it as the knight moves orthogonally two squares and then to an adjacent orthogonal square on a different path from the original trajectory. That's not the guy you want to date. Somebody else may just say up 2 over 1, up 1 over 2. There's lots of different similar ways to describe that simple action. They're all correct, and there's no problem with the description because the net effects are the same. But what if you ask 2 players, given a specific chess position, what is the best move and what is the worst move? For some positions, the answers are clear and obvious. This may not make sense to the non-chess players, but think about it, back in the I'm going to give you a gift or I'm going to steal your car. There are chess moves that are that good or that dumb. But not all of them are that way. There may be a single move that guarantees a win or a loss or a draw. But for other positions, the answer is not so obvious, and there may in fact be several winning moves or losing moves. The presence of several possible right answers doesn't mean that we should forfeit the game. The fact that we haven't found a single best answer does not mean we toss up our hands and say we've lost. We have no strategy. We can do nothing here. We've identified moves that are better and moves that are worse. We've identified some moves that are more likely to win us the game. And we may on occasion make mistakes. But to try to claim that without some kind of consensus, you can't have any kind of moral position, that you have no strategy, that it's anarchy without some absolute being handed down from on high, is insane. And it is part of the lie that just drives me crazy. Additionally, the fact that someone in a group keeps pointing to a clearly losing move and calling it a winning move doesn't matter. Those are the people that I'm saying you can disregard. If we've identified that a move is obviously losing, if we've identified that killing another person just because they spit on your face is a bad moral action, anybody who says that it's okay to do that can be disregarded. We've settled that problem. We've solved it. We're not saying that their opinion is no longer valid in a broad realm of ideas. We're talking about with respect to this specific situation, you no longer matter if you're going to keep holding that position until you do one of a couple different things. One is to demonstrate why your position is correct, is moral, has a benefit. does something productive for society. So when I talk about, a minute ago, the fact that secular morality is a natural evolving process, what do I mean? It means from very simple beginnings, we're able to construct a complex, robust, dynamic moral system. And what simple beginnings do we tend to work with? McDonald's. Life is generally preferable to death. Pleasure is generally preferable to pain. Benefit is generally preferable to harm. And we can begin building. Now, there are exceptions to each of those, usually when those are in conflict. There are a number of other possible core values that you can begin with when you talk about bettering the society, but we can begin with this. It may be the case that death may be preferable to life when continuing that life causes pain or harm, or when it saves the life considered more valuable by the individual. We live in a complicated world, and even the most basic values are going to conflict and place us in the position of waiting. As our understanding increases, we build a pool of situations to consider. And some complicate the landscape initially, and some clarify other decisions. One big advantage of secular moral systems is that the old rules can be updated with new rules. By contrast, non-secular moral systems, as we've already talked about, are typically restricted in their ability to evolve at all. I'm not advocating specific moral positions when I use these as examples, although I think you'd be hard-pressed to find too many people who would disagree with these as kind of general guidelines, along with things like individual freedom, the ability of each and every person to satisfy their own desires within the limits of a cooperative society, recognizing that my freedoms and rights end where somebody else's start. But we can build off what we've learned. We can take the greatest thoughts from wherever they find them, whether it's in a religion or in a secular line of thought, and we can get rid of the baggage and the garbage. That's the other negative aspect of non-secular moralities, is they don't have a good mechanism for getting rid of the garbage, which is why you have the Catholic Church, and this isn't a moral issue either, but it's about doctrine, getting rid of limbo, eventually. Making apologies to Galileo 400 years afterwards, that type of thing. There's no quick and easy mechanism for them. And by the way, in a secular system, it's not necessarily always quick and easy either. But there is a mechanism there, and it's data-driven. As I've noted elsewhere, we've got the ability to assess actions and their results with respect to goals. Outliers can be safely regarded until they demonstrate the efficacy of their values. It doesn't make us closed-minded to dismiss the KKK's views on human rights. If anything, it makes us responsible. In situations where we cannot properly evaluate an action to determine its moral values, we fall back to the foundational values of the system. One of the primary is that the fundamental freedom of the individual is paramount. There are two ways of looking at rights. Either we have only the rights that we explicitly enumerate, or we have every right except for the ones we specifically restrict. The former throttles liberty and mires us in bureaucracy and fascism. The latter exalts liberty and allows us to avoid anarchy. But wait a minute, by what right do you dismiss the KKK's views on human rights? By the same criteria that I disregard anything else. It's not simply a matter of, I don't like your bigotry, go away, which could be fine if you're just trying to shorthand it and you don't feel like actually debating it. It's, you haven't demonstrated that your views contribute to the betterment of society in any recognizable way. You haven't demonstrated that your core values represent an improvement. And I have evidence that demonstrates that what you're pushing is not the type of society that we want. And that's the extent of being able to eliminate these outliers for issues that we've resolved and get on with it. Now back to not moving. So what kind of world do you want to live in? Most people tend to object to the government making and imposing laws on what you can do in the privacy of your own home. Not everybody, but most people. Yet that's the same sort of externally imposed system that non-secular moral systems tend to be. What kind of world do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a world that values freedom, societal health, physical, mental, emotional? Do we want to live in a society that encourages opportunity, fair competition, open exchange of ideas? Do we want to live in a society that prospers without doing so at the expense of its citizens? Do we prefer a democracy to a dictatorship? What sort of limits should we impose when it comes to extending our moral views onto others? Those are hard questions that we're not going to address in here because we're talking about the system at a meta level. We have to get past the first step before we can actually start addressing the others. It's a lot of complex questions that we need to address as our planet moves forward. And we do ourselves and future generations a great disservice if we jump into these issues with an inferior system, and we do a greater disservice by denying that this trend is occurring in order to cling to our treasured traditions as the non-secular moral systems do. So, I told you you'd sense a trend because it's pretty much a simple internal-external comparison, and I don't think any of you need to see the following slide, which changes them to democracy and dictatorship. We have the tools that we need, and we should continue to use them. A secular moral system is one that is free from appeals to external authorities. It is robust, inclusive. It is a powerful tool that has been evolving and improving with each new nugget of understanding that we gain. Earlier, I said that I hoped anyone would and should agree that secular morals are superior, and in fact, they already do. Individuals who ostensibly reject secular moral systems in favor of one of the more traditional non-secular moral systems implicitly recognize and acknowledge the superiority of secular moral systems. And you can tell this by both their actions and by comparing their actual values with the traditional values associated with their particular religion. None of them are advocating slavery in the way that their books do. None of them are advocating the same positions with respect to women that their books do. Some of them are still tied up on the women thing. Some of them are still tied up on the sexuality thing. But by and large, we see that the values that most people have, even when they claim they're adhering to a religious system, are influenced and have been changed by secular values that directly contradict what the traditional views of their organization are. That is a bald-faced admission that their system is inferior to a secular system. Many religious individuals and groups have modified their personal sense of morality away from the foundations of their religion and realigned themselves with the values encouraged by secular progressives. They have, for all intents and purposes, adopted the views of a secular system while clinging to the foundation and rationalizing it away with personal interpretations. They have, in a very real sense, adopted a secular moral system as a new external source for their morality. They're so rigidly stuck in this idea that it needs to come from outside that they don't even realize that when they make changes, they're taking it from outside. We need to show people that they do not have to be stealth secularists. They can actually join in and participate. They can be proud of their participation and directly benefit from their contributions rather than standing in opposition to the very values they secretly embrace. Secular moral systems are inclusive. The authority comes from within. The focus is on improvement. It's based on our interests, and the authority is based directly on a demonstration that the results meet the goals. Secular moral systems are superior because we say so. And when because I say so was an unsatisfying answer, because we say so is an immensely satisfying answer. Because I say so doesn't impart any understanding at all. Because we say so is the product of understanding. It is the demonstration of understanding. Because I say so is some hollow assertion. Because we say so is an empowering statement. We need to not make appeals to the unknown. We need not, indeed we should not, opt for the lazy, unthinking path. We cannot afford to struggle against progress in order to embrace antiquated ideals. We are intelligent, empathetic, compassionate beings, and we have the ability to set goals and solve problems. We've been doing it for as long as we've had the capacity for thought, and we continue to get better at it. The fact that we're not yet perfect at it doesn't cripple us. It drives us, because the goals of a secular morality include the goal of getting better at getting better. There should be no question that this method is superior. And it's time we stopped allowing ourselves to get mired in fallacious appeals to ignorance and authority, and simply continue to get on with the business of building a better world. Thank you. Yeah.
Early on, you mentioned that the only thing you could really look at was behaviors, and that your thoughts were something that maybe the thought police would have to deal with.
Yeah.
But then later, when we were comparing the good child and the better
We look at
child,
motivations.
yeah, we looked at motivation,
Yeah.
which
We're still assessing an action. We are taking in consideration the motivation. When I said when I talked about the thought police, I'm saying that there's no moral assessment of a thought alone. For example, pedophiles. There's nothing at all intrinsically immoral about an individual who is sexually attracted to a child. It's the action that becomes immoral. There has to be some action that impacts somebody besides themselves. It's really largely an irrelevant issue because we can't get into people's heads to see what they're thinking. We can, though, assess what they're thinking with respect to the action to color it, I guess.
well, in that case, like with the pedophile, you might have somebody that had these thoughts but didn't do it because they didn't want to get arrested,
Right.
and another one that didn't do it because realized that this was an abomination,
Right.
and that there was something wrong with them, and they weren't going to do this because it was wrong. And so you would have two actions that were the same, or the two non-actions that were the same, but for different reasons. One would be a moral reason.
Sure,
one
if
would be
you looked at an intentional non-action as an action, I guess you could assess it that way too. Although, I think generally we would kind of limit how much we worry about that. Because if somebody tells me they didn't punch me in the face because they knew it was the wrong thing to do, I'm not going to give them a whole lot of credit for that. I don't care what their motivation was, I'm just glad they didn't do it.
But that went right back to your two children example, as one did or didn't do the action good for goodness sake, and the other one did or didn't do the action because they feared for repercussions.
Don't know. Generally, I tend to look at it as only assessing actions. I think that you can make a case that we could look at some inactions or intentional inactions as an action. But when I was talking about the thought police and not addressing thoughts, it's that the thought itself alone, absent anything else, I don't think has any moral value.
I think it's
But it
the
could be
choice. It's the choice is an action,
The choice is an action.
as opposed to the thought
Sure.
not being the action.
I'll buy that. Go ahead, you had a good idea.
I have a question about the internal versus external, and I
One's
have,
inside and one's out.
I have a bit of a concern about the idea that we make these decisions internally because we are products of our environment, and we're products of our community around us, our parents imparting these moral values to us as we're growing up. And my parents were very religious people that raised me in a religious environment, and they still take credit for me being a moral person,
Sure.
even though I don't. And they're like, well, you're a moral person because we raised you as a moral person. And I think to a certain extent that's true. We know that killing people is wrong because our parents taught us that killing people is wrong. I don't necessarily think that we make that choice internally, that we're raised to understand that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you're not limited by that.
Originally, though.
You're not limited by that. This is what I mean by saying that if an idea comes from a religious upbringing or whatever, if it's a good idea, we keep it because it's a good idea. But we keep it because it's demonstrably good, because we can compare the results of that action or the consequences of that with our goals of the world that's like that. So, yeah, we are going to be products of our environment. It doesn't mean you're limited by that. You know, to go on with what you said, my parents are convinced that I'm working for Satan and that I'm a good boy because Jesus loves me. I don't know how.
My parents are convinced that I'm only an atheist to affect other atheists and bring them back to the fold. So I'm with you.
You wouldn't believe, it shocks me every time, it shouldn't shock me anymore, but it does surprise me. I will get emails from people who want to have a discussion, and their goal is to lead me back to Christianity in particular. And one of the things they'll start with is, I was praying, and I feel the Holy Spirit has given me specific information that God wants you to have in order to bring me back, which I love as soon as they do that, because when inevitably what they present is something that I've refuted 100 times or more. And it's something that if there was a God, he would have known this is about the dumbest thing they could possibly say. And so they've demonstrated it rather efficiently that the God they believe in absolutely does not exist, by contradiction. This God told me to tell you this. Well, then your God clearly doesn't know me very well, or he doesn't exist, or he's an ineffective communicator, or you're in, what's it? Yeah. I think though, somebody could spin this as actually demonstrating that the biblical God does exist. Because when you look at the Bible, it's kind of like this chronology of God's mistakes. He's this colossal screw-up. He makes two people and everything goes wrong. And he casts them out, and then they start breeding like rabbits, and things go wrong again. And they're building a tower, and he's flooding the earth, and all these other things. And he can't get anything right. And so instead of trying to worry about the whole world, we're just gonna focus on the Jews and try to save you from the rest of them. And that goes wrong too. So we've got to start over in volume 2 by sacrificing myself to make up for a rule I made, so that you guys can have an exclusion from the sin that I'm responsible for. It's that kind of an attitude. Maybe it is. Maybe it's proof that their God is telling them to tell me so, because he gets it so wrong. I got way off track. Yeah.
I have a two-part question. First is, do you think that the advocation of secular morality should itself be valued by our society in the same way it's valued by society, life, freedom of speech, etc., and that should indeed be educated in the same way to other people and children?
Yes.
But then doesn't it become external?
Right.
No.
Something that the society.
Because if we are imparting secular values to our children, it becomes external.
I'm not saying impart the specific values. I'm talking about teaching them the basics that are involved in the secular moral system. Much like the thing that I advocate all the time in pretty much every discipline is don't teach kids what to think so much as how to think. Give them the critical thinking, skepticism tools. And you can, in a social studies class, in a civics class, you can discuss how these tools apply to moral assessments and evaluating people's character. And you can do so without imposing any specific values on them. And I think you can have valuable class discussions on that.
And that was actually the second part of my question was, should those values that are decided by the society to be superior, such as freedom of speech, individual liberty or sanctity of life, or the idea of secular morality itself, be taught to children who are themselves children of parents who disagree with them, whether or not the parents agree?
I think we already do that to some extent.
Right. I mean, is it right for a society?
I don't know.
Who has decided? Yeah, who has decided?
We have to use a little debate and discussion and comparison of results in order to find out. I don't know. I know that there's a part of me that would say, yes, we absolutely do. And then there's a part that immediately recognizes that might make us guilty of the same thing that we're actually opposing, which would be taking secular students, putting them in school, and having people teach them particular religious values. Which is one of the reasons why I talked about, it feels odd to call 80% of the population outliers, but they are. They are on many issues. And it's not so much that I think we need to worry about teaching kids specific values at all. We got bigger fish to fry, and we give them the tools, and we change the world around them, and we're done. Because that's how religions end up changing. The world changes around them. The only reason that Christians aren't advocating slavery now is because we settled it 150 years ago. They were then. There were preachers that got up and said, "Hey, the Bible says right here," and it does. The only people will say, how big of a threat is Islam with respect to Christianity? Yeah, worldwide it's a bigger threat, and it's also younger. It didn't get dragged kicking and screaming into a modern era the way Christians did, although Puritans kind of hung us up for a little while. I'm still an advocate of not actually teaching the specifics like that. I'm actually more about discussion and giving them the tools, and I think that I think kids will figure it out on their own. I mean, it took me 30 some odd years, but when people have their kids over to events and stuff, and I have to talk to them, unless they're really little, I talk to them like I'm talking to you. And we'll talk about the same kinds of things. They don't have the same interests. And it may be because I don't have any kids, and I'm just doing it wrong. But I tend to have a really good, I think they're going to be okay. I've seen too many kids that are raised in the harshest religious environments, completely indoctrinated. And something at some point triggers that lets them first say, oh, it's okay to question, or it's okay to doubt, or I doubted and I didn't immediately get fried. And then kind of ease away. Doesn't happen all the time. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm that keen on teaching the specific values.
Sure, but so it's probably not,
Other than the ones that we have as a society already adopted and encoded.
that's what I
The
mean.
religious freedoms, the liberties, the things outlined in the Constitution.
But that's what I mean. So if there are some of those values, including the idea of second morality itself, that are opposed to the values that parents themselves have,
Yeah, tough. This is the society that you agree to live in, and these are the values that we're going to teach. Now, but you also have to say that we're open to changing those with a demonstration that we should.
okay.
Unless we get the homeschoolers.
Yeah.
I know you're kind of making this dichotomy between secular, non-secular, internal, external, and democratic dictatorship. And we often talk about the
I was talking about white black, but I thought it'd be too hard.
we're talking about, we often talk about that we have a secular nation, right? And I'm wondering if that's equivocation. So I'm actually wanting to say, by what you were talking about as secular as a framework to look at a system or rules or something like
Are
that.
you asking why I use those labels?
Well, more specifically, I'm asking, you're saying, by the way in which you put out secular in this presentation, do we have a secular government?
Sure. Is it being used that way? Not necessarily.
Because, I mean, in some respect, you can say that the ways in which our government, that we say it's secular because, oh, it was written down, is imposed.
Idealistically, it isn't. It should be, and it's formed that way. Realistically, it's not, which is why we have so many problems and why we're fighting these battles over and over. Yeah.
I'm still trying to think exactly how to word this because I'm listening to all the conversations about internal and external. And the way I understand you using those terms, by external you mean rules, laws, guidelines handed down from something outside of humans.
Or outside of the actual participants. I mean, it could have been another human, just somebody, like a king would be handing down laws that he's actually not subject to. That would be external. Yeah, outside. Somebody who's not subject to those rules.
Right.
With your kids have to go to bed at 8, but you don't have to.
Right.
Which I'm not sure if I completely follow that thought, but internal, the way I understand it, is like inside, it's like the people who are in the group that are making up the rules.
Yep.
And so in a way, I think there is no way to get outside of society or outside of people, because I don't believe in God. I don't believe there's any transcendent thing. So I actually think that the secular, non-secular distinction is somewhat moot. And that what's actually the most important thing that I heard you say was systems that are responsive and change to the people that are in them, and systems that aren't responsive and don't change in response to the people that are.
Yeah, you've already kind of moved on to the follow-on thing. In the internal, external, I mean, we're looking at the big world thing. If everybody in this room got together and said, okay, we're a little society, and we're going to have rules about what pictures I can show on this thing here. We could make up all the rules ourselves. We could talk about them. We could change it. We could go through and look at some examples, find out which ones were pleasant, which ones weren't. The idea that any individual in this group could say, it doesn't matter what the rest of you think. There's a guy outside who owns and operates this building that will not let you put that on the screen. That is something that is external. May be valid in the sense that he can make a demonstration that he has some authority. He owns this space, she owns this space, they own this space, and they have the right to say what goes on here. That's valid because there's a demonstration of authority. It doesn't make it any more moral. It doesn't make them any more morally right. Because if they came in and said, you can't show, any blasphemous images here, which wouldn't happen at a UU church, but if they did that, it wouldn't mean they're morally right. It would just mean that they're opposing their authority that we've had to recognize by virtue of getting this facility. If we were having the same thing at my place, it doesn't matter which one of you says the guy outside can't show that image. Tough. My place. And that's the point. This is our place. This planet, this existence, this reality, it's our place. And we got to own it.
So how would you describe or define the set of moral values that come literally internal to the individual? Like, I'm not going to say, like, I may obey the law that, 65 is the speed limit, but I also don't think it's morally wrong for me to go 66. I'm going to abide by it because it is an external set of values that has been determined by.
Do you think it's wrong for you to go to 166?
Yes, because I made that on that personal evaluation. Like, I've evaluated those things within me. I haven't said.
But it wasn't arbitrary. It's not like you had a gut feeling that 166 was just wrong.
Right.
It's that you understand the consequences of going that fast. That the potential harm increases dramatically as you begin speeding.
Right. So the question I'm asking is, 65 is what the local society came to agreement upon.
Yep.
What do you call that evaluation that I did that determined that 66 was still okay? Because that's what I consider internal.
It's
66 is
Now-
not that
now-
far over from 65.
But that's because of what you pay to get.
Right, that's like those are the details of the comment I made. What I'm actually asking is, you define internal as internal to the group. I'm asking, what do you define internal to the individual?
The question that I have regarding that is that when you say that you determined that, for example, 66 is okay, if you get pulled over for doing 66, are you going to acknowledge that you were breaking the law?
Yes.
Okay. Then you already acknowledged this societal thing, and you have a different view, and you're going to push the boundary a little bit. I don't even know that this is a moral question. You recognize that it's like, see, speeding is the example I would have used to explain this better. You've stolen that opportunity. I don't know what I would call it. You're asking what I would call it. I don't know that I would actually consider it any kind of moral evaluation.
I guess I'm just saying that from my understanding of what you said, you were defining the establishment of that 65 speed limit as an internal situation, based on the way you define internal and external. And I'm asking
if we were
for a
looking at speed
definition
limits as
of value system that's established in actuality within the individual. What do you call that? If that's internal, then what's me saying?
well, I'm talking about internal within the system, and you're talking about internal within yourself. It's just your personal take of it. I have my own personal take that disagrees with a number of positions that the society that I live in has adopted. I can work to change those in the areas where I think that they're dramatically wrong, but I may be forever in the minority. I may be, people, we go back to, I use this example, I guess, because some friends of mine are in this position. There are plenty of people who would advocate legalization of marijuana. Currently, it's illegal. And there are plenty of people who say you've given no good reason for this to be illegal and for something else to be legal. For example, comparing marijuana and alcohol. And those people have their own personal take on it, which may eventually become the de facto standard. If enough people think that 66 is safe enough, and we look at the studies and we say, you know what, when we let people drive 66, it's really not any worse, then it becomes the new de facto standard. It's the way things change. And so when you look around it, it's not that we have to go for a happy medium or even necessarily a consensus, although consensus does tend to drive. Your personal view on it can be dramatically different, and you are doing what we all do, sacrificing some personal liberty, your ability to go 75 or 80, in order to live in a society that protects your interests. I don't know what else you would call it other than just your personal evaluation. I don't know that it has any moral onus on it.
I just feel like there's an obvious paradox that arises when you consider that these are all, like, this can vary from spot to spot, And I remember being, 18 years old, I remember being 17 years old and dating my girlfriend and my birthday coming, and the next day it was a crime. And I just kept thinking, like, this makes no sense. But it's what this local society has established as rule. Yeah. And I'm sure I could find a parent who could make an argument that it's 100% the wrong and right or black and white.
And there are really exceptions. There are, I mean, this is what I was talking about when I said you're not going to find a one-size-fits-all answer. And so in some cases you do go with a happy medium. And in other cases, you go with whichever one has the loudest voice. And it doesn't make it morally right at all. When we're talking about the actual rules that govern what we can and can't do, you're not necessarily talking about what we consider moral. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that there's a difference between laws and morals. Laws may be based on morals, but they don't always perfectly embody morals because morals are kind of squishy and gray. And I think the fact that when you said, am I immoral if I go 66, most people in here went like, no, shows that this is not internal to you. If we all turned to you and went, oh my God, you went 66! I can't believe it. We all freaked out. You'd suddenly start going, well, gee, maybe I should rethink that. Because everyone you knew around you was saying that you were doing something horrible.
But he didn't tell you
But
that
we
he was
did.
doing it at 20.
So I guess I'm just saying that, like, this is not internal to you. We're all in agreement. In other words, you are going with the general flow of society.
Well, I guess the point I'm making is whether we're in agreement or not doesn't determine whether it's internal to me or not. It just happens to be in sync. And like to me, all law is, or I'm sorry, the only time I'm not breaking the law is when what I feel like doing and what someone else has established I should do just happen to sync up. And when they don't, I'm committing a crime. And when they do, I'm a law-abiding citizen.
Because he made that decision to go 66 without knowing what anybody else.
I actually don't think he did.
But based on what you're saying, like we all live in an obviously majority Christian society, so there is a large part of the population that's looking at all of us and saying, "Oh God, like you people are not abiding by the obvious truth." Like that influence is there, and we're still sitting here feeling within moral correctness.
Yeah, I think that shows there's a lot of room for flexibility.
I'm going to jump in for a second and give a friend of mine the last word, or nearly the last word, because we need to be down by 5:30 and it's almost 4:30 and I don't want any traffic problems. So it's chilling.
Well, yeah, I have a question kind of related to that, partially to my sort of disagreement there. I would say that it's definitely internal for the governed population. But for the individual, for me, I consider myself amoral. I don't consider my internal decisions to be moral in any respect, or immoral in any respect. But I'm part of the governed populace, so the society has determined a moral structure within which I have to live, and that gives influence on me in how to choose my behavior, whether it will be beneficial to me or detrimental to me. So the going 66 would be my acceptance of the risks and the benefits based on the morality that the governed population has developed internally. So my question for Matt...
It's a pragmatic, amoral position on your part.
Right. Yeah. My question to you would be, would you consider any single individual's personal choices to be moral-based or based on benefit and detriment in relation to the moral standards they live in as part of the governed populace? Like, would the word moral even apply to the individual choice?
It would to me.
Okay.
Because I don't care whether it's ultimately pragmatic or what they would consider it. I'm the person who's going to make a moral assessment of it. And while, in many cases, the moral assessment may be neutral. For example, I don't know your name. Dillahunty, that's right. We've met before. My moral assessment of his driving 66 is that in 99% of the cases it's morally neutral. I couldn't care less. Now, if he was doing it in a 20 or in a school zone, or on a motorcycle, even in and out of traffic that was going a lot slower, obviously I think he's taking a risk that I would consider to have moral implications because he's showing reckless disregard for not only his own life, but the life of others, which I think is where we get into kind of moral responsibilities. But it doesn't matter to me what his motivation is, I'm still making a moral assessment. And I'm fine with somebody else saying they're not making a moral assessment, as long as we can get down to the brass tacks of how are we going to live. And I think that the best way to, the secular moral system or the secular evaluation of anything is going to give us the best benefit for how we live. Yeah, last question.
I misunderstand. It sounded like to me you were saying that his decision to do something which might endanger him and him alone is immoral.
Not like that. Not in the sense that he's only showing disregard for his own health. I think there are some cases, there are some situations where we can look at it that way. My concern, for example, we looked at helmet laws before. We've talked about helmet laws a lot. And by and large, the guys who don't, don't want to wear helmets and say that, this is none of your business, if I crash, that's fine. I'm fine with it. I'm fine with, assisted suicide, euthanasia things. But we also have a responsibility to people to make sure that they're protected to some extent from themselves. I think this is my personal take on it. Because we know that depression passes.
So you're going to externally impose?
We already do externally impose. We lock people up, but we do it in the extremes. But when I was talking about his thing, by and large, and my thing with the helmet law, is that I think if you're going to have a law that nobody has to wear helmets, then anybody who, if they don't have to wear a helmet on a motorcycle, when there's a demonstrated cost to this, is that if you're on a motorcycle and you crash and you wind up in hospital, you are entirely responsible for your hospital bills. But the rest of us shouldn't have to pay simply for something that you chose to do, because now it's no longer affecting you, it's affecting everybody else. And that is one of the things that I keep harping on, because people ask, why are you so concerned about people's beliefs? Because beliefs matter. They inform actions, they inform that they control what decisions you make, and those actions have consequences, and none of us live in a vacuum, which means every action I take, it can potentially affect lots of different people. Even if I think
You
it's
need to
going to
lose weight then, because it's costing society money.
I know.
And the government has the right to impose that on you. Perhaps even the moral obligation to do so.
I would
And in that
argue,
case, I would have to severely disagree with you.
I would argue that that there's a good reason to revisit what sort of medical benefits we allow people based on the actions that they take. I would have to concede that there may be some necessary action in that area.
So a rich person is free to risk his life or be fat, but a poor person is not, even if he can afford his own insurance.
If they can afford their own, if you can afford your own, you're good.
Except that many people will argue that, yes, but by you risking your body, it's going to make my insurance premiums as part of the pool go up. You can expand this thing and follow it to logical conclusions where you can't do anything.
Sure, and you can also draw a causal chain back to my great-great-grandfather. But we tend to look at things with regard to their proximity, and so there's a field of effect that any given action can have. For example, when I'm driving down to the back roads here in a little bit, I might take an action that forces somebody else to hit their brakes, which forces somebody else to hit their brakes, and 20 or 30 cars down the line, they have an accident because somebody else, there are other factors regarding how other people pay attention, etc. Am I responsible for all that? No. The identifying cause of an effect needs to be both necessary and sufficient and proximal. And so I think we can identify a field of influence for any given action. And so I think that part of what you're saying, and I agree, you can't follow these things down a slippery slope, otherwise you're never going to you're going to have imposition even when your system says you shouldn't. So that I now I've ended on something that I wasn't going to end on.